Hey everyone, I'm Kevin from International Dentist Central, and today I'm going to give you the essential questions that you'll need to know to nail your dental school interview. Whether you have an upcoming interview for an advanced standing program, a residency program, or any dental school interview coming up, these strategies and insights come from my over 10 years of experience interviewing and coaching thousands of dental school applicants. But before we get into the questions, I want to first talk about why many candidates fail their dental school interview. Most candidates come to their interviews pretty much unprepared for what really matters. They give generic, rehearsed responses that interviewers have heard, 100 times, and often many times that same day that you're interviewing. And what's the biggest complaint from faculty or staff members that are interviewing you? Well, if they could tell you, it would be boredom. They won't tell you that, but if they could. And if you can avoid putting them to sleep, you're actually ahead of the game in most cases compared to other candidates. In general, many faculty don't even want to be doing dental school interviews on the day that you're interviewing. Why is that? You'd think that they would care, of course, about who they're going to be working with next year, where they're going to be teaching, and they do. They're good people, and they do care about good quality candidates into their programs. But the truth is, in theory, they care, but in practice, they're really busy. And so ensuring that you're keeping not only their attention, but keeping them engaged during your interview is going to make a big difference in connecting with them and making a great impression upon them. So how do you stand out? Well, there's a couple things. Number one, you need to be more authentic. A lot of candidates miss that. They just practice maybe their responses, but without any feeling in those responses. And sometimes they're not even real responses, and so those are even less authentic. You need to be specific in your responses, include details that mean something and showcase your unique differences. And you need to show, not just tell about your strengths, and show, not just tell about who you are and what your intent is. The next thing you have to do is prepare unique stories, not just canned responses or fake stories that you found in online groups or from AI. I know that some people think it's fine to just make up stuff. I don't agree. You need to really go back to your own past, your own memories, and pull out those past experiences. And those are the things that you need to talk about. So those are just a few things, and it's really important to keep those in mind when you're answering and responding to the questions that we're going to go through. So let's get into the most essential questions in your dental school interview. For each question, I want to dive into the key questions themselves, what their purpose is, but also what's the psychology behind them. Why are they asking these questions too? So let's start with the first major question. I call this the heavy hitter. Tell me about yourself. This is going to be the most important question on your dental school interview. And what was the purpose of this? The purpose is that they want to see how you see yourself beyond just your application, beyond what you've turned in your documents. This is sort of a blank canvas, an open book for them. You're going to either be very confident when you're talking, or you're not going to be confident. You're going to look either prepared while you're discussing your background, or you're going to look completely in disarray, right? So in their mind, just to give you a little context, before they even meet with you, they've already sort of categorized you and put you into a pile. Typically, if they've invited you to an interview, you're in a good shape. You have a chance, right? So they haven't put you in the no thanks pile, but they have put you in the we're not sure or this is likely who we want, right? Based on your profile, based on your documents, based on your personal statement, and even your stats, of course, they've already categorized you. So this is your shot to move from one pile to another, or to make sure that you don't fall from the good pile to the we're not so sure pile. So psychologically, what's going on here too, and why do they like this question so much? I'd say for the most part, interviewers like this question because it allows them to see whether the candidate is going to perform and knock it out of the park, if they're going to do if they're going to have a slam dunk effect where they really nail everything that they meant to say in their interview, or they're going to allow you to fall into a place where you're saying too much about this, too little about that, not succinct, not organized, all over the place. And unfortunately, that's what I'd say a good 60 to 70% of candidates that I work with start doing the moment they start answering this question. They have no idea what to say, so they mostly just ramble on and get themselves into a fair amount of trouble this way. It's not impressive. They are starting to think about other things besides you, maybe laundry that they left, or maybe did they leave the stove on, or those papers they need to grade. All that stuff is in their minds, and suddenly you're no longer at the forefront. Even though they're smiling at you, even if they're looking at you, they've lost the interest. Next one, tell me about your family. Another way they could say this or ask this would be, tell us about your family, tell us about your background, where are you from? Give us your story, right? And in this case, what they're looking for is as much insight as they can about your environment that you had growing up. What was your family environment like? Who were the influential people in your life? What were the influential values that shaped who you are? What were their values, your family's values? And did those values seep into who you are, or did you reject them? We can tell a lot about a candidate from them discussing the important people in their lives. So if we learn that your mother was a dentist, we might learn where you got your interest in dentistry. If we learn that your father was a business person, we might learn that you have a knack for business. But even beyond, if we go deeper, we might learn about their beliefs about ethics, might learn about their desire to help people or not help people in terms of like community service, might learn about how they look at the world. They might learn about your ambition. Now, a lot of people worry about this question because, first of all, they don't know what they're asking for. Again, I just gave you sort of the psychological reasons for why they're interested in this question. They can read into a lot depending on your response. If you are trying to just avoid the question, which many candidates will try to do, they might just try to give a shallow response, right? And they might just say, well, my father worked for a company, my mother was a homemaker, and I have two brothers who are older than me, and that's who I am, right? And in that case, they might either give you a mediocre score for that because you haven't really answered what they wanted psychologically. It hasn't satisfied what they were looking for. Or they could probe you and push back and say, tell us more about your father, tell us more about your mother, tell us more about your growing up. And so they might prod you a little bit more if they want to get more out of you. So I would recommend in this one not trying to shy away from it, but really be willing to share the aspects of your growing up that you think make you come across in the best light. There are some folks that are highly ashamed or just embarrassed by their growing up and their background, and that's something that you have to be very thoughtful of and very conscious of. How are you going to tell that story in a way that acknowledges maybe there were some difficulties and some struggles, but how do you do that in a careful and effective way? Again, some people might be embarrassed, might want to avoid the question and get on with it, but if you don't give them what they're looking for, they typically will either give you a low score or they'll push you and prod you, and you might end up being in a situation where you're defensive. And once you're in defense mode in an interview, you've sort of lost the interview. So you do have to be careful with this one. The next question I want to talk about is, why did you come to the US or Canada? Now, if you're not an international candidate, which are often the candidates I work with in coaching, then you can skip to the next question. But if you are an international candidate, having a solid reason for why you got up and moved your entire life to a brand new place, started over, brand new culture a lot of times, there has to be a good reason for that. Interviewers want to hear that sincere and believable reason. They want to hear what your motivations were. Now, a lot of candidates will end up trying to, again, avoid this question. And when they do, it can backfire. They might talk about their interest in dentistry, right? That's why I picked up my whole life and moved myself to another country. They might talk about how great the technology is in the US or Canada. And those might be partial motivations. I don't take that away from anyone. I mean, yes, for a very driven, ambitious candidate, having a future goal to move to a place that has excellent education in dentistry makes a lot of sense. However, there often are other factors to people's stories, as I've learned over the years, as I talk to folks. And as I will interview folks, I can sort of like engage my BS meter and say, is this the full story, or does this sound like it's not the case? And so for me as an interviewer, I would say 80 or 90% of the time I can tell between a candidate when they say they came for a better career, because they like the technology, because they have more opportunities, etc. I can usually tell whether that person's being authentic and sincere, or whether they're just making it up and there was a different reason why they came and it had nothing to do with their career. There might be a personal aspect, there might be something about family or marriage or something like that. There may be other aspects that are going on, and I can usually tell whether what they're saying is that the full story or is there more to the story. And again, I would say that most interviewers who interview a lot of people can tell the difference. So if you give them just the fake story or just the partial story and don't give them the full story, you could be shooting yourself in the foot, because they can question your motivations, question what's really going on. And if they don't probe into that afterwards, which sometimes they don't have time to do, you might have lost the opportunity to convince them of your sincere desires to really work and live and practice in the US or Canada. And if you're not passionate about it at all and you don't even want to be here, there's a way to talk about that, but you have to be careful of that too. It's like a clear pond, right? You're looking down on the pond, you can see the bottom of the pond. That's what they like to see. They like to see, there's the bottom of that pond. Makes sense. But if you start muddling the waters and giving them confusing and sometimes opposing motivations for your desire to come to the US, and it's just all kind of like stirring it up and you're not clear, they're going to look into that pond and say, I have no idea what I'm looking at. I'm not sure what this person really wants. And that's going to be harder for them to say yes to that person. I'd rather say yes to somebody who knows what they want, they're very clear, and it's very sincere. It's not just BS I'm hearing. That's what a great response is versus a I blew it response. Now, of course, another essential question that I would say most dental school interviewers are going to get to some degree or another is, why dentistry? Why did you become a dentist? I'd say this is a super common question for those without any kind of dental degree. So if you're going from a bachelor into applying for a dental school in the US, you're going to obviously, this is going to be one of the top questions you're going to get, why dentistry? But also if you're an internationally trained dentist, you're going to be asked the same question in many cases, not always, but in many cases. Why? Because they want to see what your motivations were. What was it that made you go into this career? And are those motivations pure? Are those motivations really about wanting to help, wanting to make an impact, wanting to make a difference? Or were they selfish, greed, money-driven only, stuff like that? So that's kind of what they want to know. What's this person about? Are they really interested in being a medical practitioner and helping people? Of course, that comes with great money. It's not something to be ashamed of. But is that a factor at all? Or are they really just, hey, my father, my mother told me to be a dentist. I did. I followed along. So there's a lot of complicated reasons people become a dentist. And being that it's a tough job, right? If you've done dentistry, you know it's a tough job. You know it can be very monotonous. It can be hard on your body sometimes, often. They want to make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons and that you have a larger goal, a larger focus than just because it's a good, solid job. So, what are those pitfalls that you need to avoid, and how can you satisfy their psychological desire to know what's really going on underneath the surface of what your response is? Well, one would be, there's 1,001 cliches to people's stories on this, right? There's not a week that goes by that I don't read either a personal statement or talk to a candidate in an interview where they'll tell me some childhood story about how a brother or a sister or a mother or themselves even had some broken teeth and how they went to a dentist and it, changed their whole viewpoint and they decided to become a dentist. Now, why do I say that's a cliche? Because it's so overused. It is probably one of the top cliches out there about why someone became a dentist. In fact, people will stuff their personal statements with this response all the time. It drives me crazy, and I'm not even working for one of these dental programs, but I am advising people on what to put in their personal statements. And if I read enough of them and they drive me crazy, I'm pretty sure we can estimate that it's driving some of the programs crazy too. Professors there, staff members who have to read these stories and then have to listen to these stories in interviews. So you might end up getting pushback in an interview. Is that really the reason? Just because your brother had that teeth fixed? Is there any other reason? They're trying to fish for deeper reasons. What else was going on? Was it just the money? Was it something else? And so it depends on how you tell these stories too. You can pull off, I've seen people pull off a way of telling these stories about a family member having some dental problems that it works, it's authentic, it's coming from a real place, and they're kind of unique stories. But a lot of times what I'll find when I talk to candidates is that they're not even real. A lot of times people just make these stories up because they don't want to tell the truth, which is that a lot of times their parents told them to become a dentist or a doctor, and so they obeyed and followed. And they know intuitively that doesn't sound good. And I think they're right. It doesn't sound good to say, I became a dentist because I was told to. That doesn't show initiative. That doesn't show that much independence or independent thinking. So I do agree and I do relate to the idea of like, oh, I got to find something else to say. But the danger is using these cliches. Like, again, hey, my brother had a chipped tooth. I don't know why it always is a chipped tooth in my mind. I mean, how often are kids that are the age of 8 to 12 accompanying their sibling to the dentist? They might wait in the waiting room, but how often are they actually in the operatory? I don't know. And this is why it starts to break down because, again, there's interviewers have a BS meter and it just doesn't always make sense, especially the way they're telling these things. On the other hand, I still don't recommend you saying, my parents told me to do it. There's a lot of pitfalls on this one. This is one where I can't just give you a blanket, do this, because it's really personal and it's really unique to your own experience. Okay, so a very important question that we always want to help people practice here at IDC, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? Now, the purpose mainly is that they want to know what your weakness is or what you think your weakness is. They're looking for weaknesses. They've heard this entire interview from you, how great you are, how amazing you are. You're telling them hopefully all that good stuff. But rarely do candidates voluntarily like to talk about their weakness. So what they're really trying to get at is let's ask for their weakness. But because people don't like to talk about their weaknesses, let's butter them up a bit. Let's soften the blow a little bit. Let them brag a little bit about their strengths, which we don't really care that much about. We'll listen to it, but it's not why we're asking the question. And then after that, we'll let them talk about their weakness and they'll hopefully be a little more open and willing to talk. So this is one where I think you have to be, again, very careful because a lot of times, again, the biggest mistake I'll see people make is that they'll only talk about their weakness in this question. Remember, this is a two-part question. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Usually they'll ask it together. Sometimes not, but usually. And in this case, if you just give your strengths again, which they've heard all this past few minutes, and not give your weakness, well, that just shows you're not really listening. If that's the case, of course, they've caught you, right? So you want to make sure that you're willing to give that weakness, and it has to be a good weakness. Now, this is a whole topic. I can make an entire video on what good weaknesses are versus bad weaknesses. But a lot of people will try to disguise a strength as a weakness. They'll try to say, I care too much. I love my patients too much. I communicate too well. Silly things like that, where people obviously don't believe that, number one. And number two, they're a little ticked off. Interviewers become a little ticked off when someone refuses to give a real weakness. So I would say make sure when you're thinking about this to give a real weakness, not one that is simply a strength disguised as one. Now, that said, there's also another pitfall. Be careful of the weakness, because if that weakness is too much of a weakness, it can also make you look bad. So again, this is always about finding that very delicate middle ground, that delicate balance, and this one is no exception to that. So the last essential question that I want you to be prepared for, what are your future goals? Or another way you could hear it is, where do you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years? What are your short-term and long-term goals? Now for this question, what are they trying to get at? What's their psychological interest in hearing what your goals are? Well, they're trying to assess your aspirations as well as your ambitions and get a sense for whether those aspirations, those goals make sense given your background. Now, it's a delicate balance here because you need to have goals that are not too wild and shooting for the stars, that someone listening would look at your background, look at what you've accomplished so far, and start to be skeptical that you can pull that off. Well, you say you want to do this, this, and that, but I've seen no evidence of that in your background based on your CV, based on your personal statement. I don't buy it. I think you're just telling me this to kind of make it sound like you really are more ambitious than you are. So if you do that, it could cause, again, skepticism. And it's never great to be in a place where the interviewer doesn't believe you. Once you've done that, again, you're on the verge of losing that interview. Now, on the other hand, the danger could be that you give goals that are way too underwhelming and way too easy to accomplish, right? If your goal is just to graduate from dental school, just to graduate from a U.S. dental program, that's not going to cut it. You know, it's funny, as I think about it, I've interviewed so many candidates over the years, and almost 50% of them will say, I ask, what are your short-term goals? What are your long-term goals? 50% of them will say, my short-term goal is to graduate from a dental program. Well, obviously, that's why you're here. We don't need you to tell us what we already know. If you weren't actually interested in graduating from a dental program, you wouldn't be in front of me right now. So that's one big mistake I see people make, is that they tell something super obvious. It's kind of a missed opportunity too, because I might want to hear more about where you're going, but you're giving me a very basic, easy to accomplish goal. Now, if I look at your background and I see, wow, you really have very little impressive things going on, and your goal is super unimpressive, your short-term goals are your long-term goals, there's almost no difference between them, what am I going to think? Overall, I'm going to think this person's not that interesting, they don't push themselves very much, they seem to take the easy way out, and how attractive is that if I'm comparing them to a bunch of other candidates? Well, not that much. So if I'm desperate as an interviewer and I have nobody else to choose from, I might choose you. But if I have other choices and other people have similar stats to you, similar background, and they have more ambitious goals, well, I might go with them. I might feel more excited about them. So very important to really think about what you're going to say, but also how you're going to express this stuff. Because a lot of times people will really give just the bare minimum, give the basic response, a very short basic response, not go into it very much, and underwhelm the interviewers. Not going to work. Okay, so we've gone through what I think are some really essential questions that you should be prepared for in your upcoming dental school interview. Now, that said, there are other essential questions, as I've said before. Don't get the impression that this is all you need to worry about. These questions are it. Prepare for as many as you can, if not all of them. So hopefully knowing those questions, as well as the purpose for them asking those questions, the psychological reasons, will help you in your upcoming interview. Listen, getting invited to an interview means the school already sees something in you that they like. Now you need to bring your best, your most vivid and most authentic self to the table. I want you to prepare smarter. I want you to practice as skillfully as you can your interview responses. And I want you to stand out. Even among many impressive candidates, you can still stand out. If you need help, I'd highly recommend practicing with an interview coach that sat on the other side of the interview table and the application review table, basically. The people who have had to make the decisions about who to invite to interviews and who to accept. Not just general people who have been through an interview. Folks that have just been to an interview, been through one and even passed it, might believe they fully understood what was going on, but there is a difference when you've actually sat on the other side of that table. And this is why at IDC, all of our interview coaches have been on the other side of that table, have been through the process of having to make those tough choices about who they will accept into their program and who they will not. And for those of you who are interested in getting some support with an upcoming dental school interview, please check out Interview Mastery, our coaching program. Links in the description below. Thanks so much for watching. If you have a question, feel free to leave a comment below. And above all else, good luck with your upcoming interviews.